Zhang Ailing Agarwood ship Second Incense P2. It was daybreak, and the lights gradually faded. He sat up suddenly. He needed to get out of here, quickly. He didn't want to see the servants. Of course he didn't have to explain to them why his new wife had disappeared, but he didn't want to see them. He hurried to the gauge and drove the car out at dawn. I'm sorry, running around in the mountains at night. Nothing will happen, right? At least he should call Mikira's house to ask if she has returned home. If not, he should visit relatives and friends in all directions for news. Report to the patrol room. Report to the water detective team. Report to the steamship company. He smiled in the wind. Should she have caused him so much pain on their first wedding morning? A person who feels worse than death is not responsible for anyone. He drove the car more than 10 miles in one breath and arrived at a small club on the coast that he organized with a few single friends. Today is not the weekend. His friends are all working, so he is the only one in the simple green-painted cabin. He sat on the beach amidst the heat of the sun, sand, and seawater, and spent a morning and an afternoon. The whole world is like a hollowed-out tooth. Numb, but I don't feel anything. I just feel a little sore when the wind comes. When he believed that he had regained control, he drove back again. The servant saw him and did not dare to ask anything. He called Mrs. Michelle. Mrs. Michelle said, "Hey, you are Roger." Roger said, "Is the girl at your place?" Mrs. Michelle paused and said, "Here." Roger said, "I'll be here right away." Mrs. Mikir paused again and said, "Okay, come on." Roger held the receiver in his hand and did not hang it up. I heard that the other party was also holding the receiver quietly in his hand, as if he was stunned for a while, and then hung up with a click. Roger took the car to the high street, thinking all the way that he took this matter too seriously. Shyness is the norm for girls. Girls who grow up in a special environment may be more confused than others. Their living together is not without hope of success. The current Hong Kong is the background of yesterday's unpleasant memories, but they can go to Japan or Hawaii for their honeymoon together. In that remote and beautiful place, he can try to give her some love education. Love education. Those kind of disgusting terms will always rouse his disgust. At that moment, he almost wished that he would marry a more humane, experienced and bad woman, a woman who did not need education of love. When he arrived at the high street, Mrs. Michelle opened the door herself and said with a smile, "You just came at this time, Roger. We are so anxious. You do have the temper of children, and the trouble is simply outrageous." Roger asked, "Where is Sexy?" Mrs. Michelle said, "On the balcony of the back building." She led the way upstairs. Roger felt that although she managed to adopt a light-hearted and joking attitude, her face was alternately red and white, and she looked uncertain. She seemed a little afraid of him, and seemed a little unhappy, blaming him for not apologizing. Roger pursed his lips. Why should he apologize? What did he do wrong? At the top of the stairs, Mrs. Michelle stopped, pressed one hand on Roger's arm, and said hesitantly, "Roger." Roger said, "I know." He walked alone to the back stairs. Mrs. Michelle held her hand on the stairs and said with a smile, "I wish you good luck." Roger only walked a few steps and suddenly stopped. Yesterday at noon, before the wedding, like a curse, she had blessed them. He frowned, closed his eyes quickly, and then opened them again. Without turning round, he said hastily, "Thank you," and entered the room. It was Kessling's bedroom, dark and unlit, with the smell of talcum powder floating in the air. The glass door was open, and Sushi, who had probably just taken a shower, was sitting on the iron railing of the small balcony with her back to him, wearing a white silk dressing gown. The street under the balcony is sloping, with mud and grass falling for 10 feet. Therefore, at a glance, there is nothing. All you can see is the sea at dusk, and on the other side of Kowloon, a string of green gasoline lamps, twinkling one after another. The ground blinked. Roger stood at the glass door and called out in a low voice, "Sexy." Sexy didn't move, but she couldn't help her white silk shirt being blown up by the wind and patting the railing. And Roger couldn't care either. He couldn't help but tremble in his voice. He walked up behind Sexy and wanted to put his hands on her shoulders, but his hands made futile gestures in the air and dropped again. He said, "Xiaoxi, please forgive me." He said this against his true intention, because now he had forgiven her innocence. Cixi turned around, grabbed his hand, put it on her cheek, and cried, "I forgive you, I forgive you." "Oh Roger, why didn't you give me a chance to say this earlier?" "What? I've hated you all day," Roger said. "Honey," she turned around to be close to him, in danger of sliding down the railing. When he got closer and let her lean against him, it seemed more dangerous. He hesitated for a while, then slipped under the railing and sat on the second railing, facing inward. The two of them sat facing each other like children. Roger said, "We will go on our honeymoon tomorrow." Cixi said in surprise, "Didn't you say you have to wait until next month, after the big exam is over?" Roger said, "No, tomorrow. Japan, Hawaii, Manila, you name it." Cixi held his hand tighter. Yesterday, Roger's attitude towards her was wrong, but after these twists and turns, he now knows how to repent. This was the first step in the love education she gave him. Japan, Hawaii, under the mysterious moonlight of foreign countries, she can complete her education of love, she said. "Do you think they are willing to let you go?" Roger smiled. "Can they control me? In any case, I have been working here for 15 years, so this can always be accommodated." Sushi said, "How long can we go? 6 weeks? 2 months?" Roger said, "The whole summer vacation." Cixi tightened his hand again. "The sky is getting dark and the wind is getting tight." Roger sat in a relatively low position, and the thin corners of his clothes were blown by the wind and flew straight to his face. She smiled and used both hands to protect his cheeks. Her thumbs slowly rubbed along his shield hair and along his eyelids. This time, she didn't say anything, but he couldn't help but remember her warm words. He said, "Should we go back?" She nodded. They linked arms and walked through Kathleen's room and out. Mrs. Michelle was still standing where she was, at the top of the stairs upstairs. At the entrance of the stairs downstairs, Mila Sheng stood. With auburn hair disheveled, her face white, a little swollen under her eyes, her head raised. Her pointed chin stretched forward as hard as she could, as if she had had an affair with Mrs. Mikir upstairs. "A heated argument," Roger said. "Good night, Mila Sheng." Mila Sheng did not answer. She hung her arms straight. Her fingers spread apart and tightened. Mrs. Mikir took 3 steps and then 2 steps to rush downstairs ahead of them. She hugged Mila Sheng and pushed her against the wall, as if she was afraid that she would do something. Roger couldn't help but change his color when he saw this situation. Cixi leaned her head on his arm and whispered, "Hawaii." "Yes, they're going to Hawaii tomorrow, far away from Mila Sheng." Mrs. Mikir, "Pooh. They know there, although the number of people involved is not large, it is enough to cause embarrassment. Of course, they would still have to meet these people after they returned from their trip. But at that time, they had a truly close bond. All suspicions were gone, and they were no longer afraid of anyone." Roger smiled slightly at Sue, and the two of them still walked downstairs holding hands, walking in front of Mila Sheng. Even though it was an early summer night, the temperature dropped suddenly. Roger could feel the white air from Mila Sheng's breath blowing on his neck. He turned back to Mrs. Mikir and said, "Goodbye, Mom." Sushi also said, "Mom, see you tomorrow." Mrs. Mikir said, "See you tomorrow, my dear." Mila Sheng snorted softly. I don't know whether she laughed or moaned. She said, "Mom, my girlfriend is braver than me after all." I never said a word to Frank on the phone afterwards. When she mentioned her husband Frank's name, she raised her thin lips. A row of small teeth was exposed. Under the light, they were so white that they turned blue. Little blue teeth, Roger shuddered. Mrs. Mikir said, "Come on, Mirata Sheng. Let's go to the balcony to enjoy the cool air." Roger and Cixi went out and got in the car. They talked little in the car. All they talked about was the various procedures for buying ferry tickets tomorrow. Cixi planned to pack her bags as soon as she got home. When she got home, Roger told his servants to prepare dinner. The servants still seemed to be a little confused and lost their minds. The bedroom had not been tidied for them. The lamp was still lowered, less than a foot away from the bed. Roger looked up at Sexy's photo and then looked down at Sexy. He couldn't believe that she was really in this room. He held the lampshade with his hand, aimed the light, and shined it directly on her face. Sexy couldn't open her eyes, so she smiled and shouted, "Hey, hey, what are you doing?" She covered her eyes with her hands, tilted her head back, and when she smiled, she revealed a row of little his teeth were so white they turned blue. Little blue teeth, but how beautiful. Her light golden hair was floating in the shadow of the lamp. People with such soft hair should always have soft dreams in their heads, right? There should always be him in the dream, right? He threw away the lamp, and it swayed low, shaking their huge black shadows throughout the room. He wanted to kiss her, but she said, "Now you kiss my cheek first. Later, when we say goodnight, maybe I will let you kiss my mouth, later." He was going to push up the lamp and return it to its original place. She said, "No, let it go. I like these shadows." Roger smiled. "The shadows make me a little panic." Our smallest movements were magnified by them more than 10 times and performed on the roof. He said carefully, "I think it's not big enough." "Hey, Roger, I want everyone to know how much I love you. I want everyone to know what a lovely person you are." Roger thought again, kiss her. Pooh knocked on the door and came in to report, "Mr. Buck is here." Sexy pouted and said, "Look, before you go to ask the principal for leave, he came to stop you first." Roger smiled and said, "How can this happen?" "If so, he came just in time to save me from looking for him tomorrow." Then he hurried to the guest room. Buck stood in front of the window with his hands behind his back, facing outward. He is a tall and slender man with a somewhat hunched back. He still has 2 locks of snow-white hair on his temples, but only a bright red head is left in the middle of his head, like a wedding egg. Roger smiled and said, "Good evening, Mr. Buck. I was just looking for you. We are going to Hawaii tomorrow. Although the school is not on vacation yet, I want to ask your forgiveness for going ahead. McPherson can take my place. I think you can leave matters in the dormitory to Lambert." Buck turned around and looked at him, and said slowly, "Oh, you are going to Hawaii. Is your wife going to go with you?" Roger laughed and said with a smile, "As usual, spend time together. During the honeymoon, your wife always goes with you, right? You don't necessarily need to bring the cook with you." Buck did not laugh in agreement with him, but continued to follow him and asked, "Is your wife happy to go?" Roger was surprised. Looking at him, he replied with a different voice. Of course, Buck blushed and seemed to be angry. Then he thought about it again and sighed, "Abden, you know she is still a child, a wayward child." Roger said nothing, only looking at him with his eyes open. When Buck was about to continue speaking, he seemed a little embarrassed. He turned his back again, faced the window, coughed lightly, and said, "Burden, we have been working together for 15 years. In these 10 years, in the past 5 years, I think your work spirit and various aspects have satisfied us. As for your private life, we have no right to interfere. Even if we have the right to interfere within a limited scope, we have nothing to find fault with." Roger walked to the window and asked, "What on earth is going on, Buck? Please tell me directly. Do we need to be polite when we are such familiar friends?" Buck looked deeply at him. He glanced at it, as if he was suspicious of him playing dumb. Roger said harshly, "What is going on?" Buck coughed again and said eloquently, "I think you didn't control your own emotions more strictly this time. And you didn't control your wife's behavior more strictly this time, so that the blame fell on the people who were not on good terms with you." "In my hand," Roger burst out a sentence from between his teeth and said, "Tell me, Buck, what happened?" Buck said, "At 2 o'clock last night, your wife ran into the boys' dormitory. It seemed that she was a little frightened. She didn't tell them much, but it was enough information for their wild thoughts. This morning, she came to see me and asked me to come out and make the decision for her. Naturally, I was so embarrassed that I came up with a few words to send her away. Unexpectedly, she didn't do anything and went to see Malishi. You know that Malishi was very unhappy with you because of the expulsion of the 2 students last time. He knew it. She has no good reason for divorce, but he promised to find a lawyer for her and make the matter bigger. In the afternoon, Your mother-in-law took her daughter round to visit friends, especially your colleagues. Now it is almost above the middle level in Hong Kong. All the British families know about it." After hearing these words, Roger's face turned green, but he still looked very relaxed. He leaned against the window, his two thumbs in his trouser pockets, and his exposed fingers gently patted his thighs. Hearing the last sentence, he seemed to be unable to bear it any longer and laughed out loud. "This matter. I still want to ask you. This matter. What exactly happened?" "Did I break the law?" Buck replied evasively. "Legally, of course there is no legal problem." The end of Roger's smile was a bit like a sob. He suddenly found that he had trouble explaining, even to his closest friends, such as Buck. He had no way to explain the misunderstanding. As for other people, the British society above the average level in Hong Kong, what can he say to those people? Those men are like small tin alarm clocks. They eat, drink tea, sit on the toilet, and sit in the office according to the time. There is nothing in their minds except the ticking of the pendulum. Perhaps it is because of the influence of the hot climate in the East. The clock is not very accurate, but a clock is still a clock. The woman has wear upon hair all day long, and her furry face looks like a woolen sweater. Can he explain to these people the shortcomings of his delicate family education? Roger himself likes to be an ordinary person. Now, the environment forced him and pushed him outside the circle of the public. Only then did he feel the stupidity in the circle, the cruelty of stupidity. How could it not be scary outside the circle? Little blue teeth, a huge black shadow swaying above his head, poking with fingers. Many cold thoughts stuck to his face like newly woven spider webs. He shook his head and tried his best to remove the web. Got rid of it. He put a hand on Buck's shoulder and said, "I'm really sorry for putting you in such a difficult situation." "I'll resign tomorrow," Buck said. "Where are you going?" Roger shrugged and said, "There are many places to go: Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing, Hankou, Xiamen, Singapore. There are many universities." "Are British people in China unemployed?" Buck said. "I advise you not to go to Shanghai. The universities there are, most of them are sponsored by churches. You know they are very strict in selecting professors. I mean, you know their usual prejudices. As for places like Beijing, the church atmosphere in schools is also quite strong." Roger smiled and said, "Don't worry about me, Buck. You make me feel even more sorry." "Well, see you tomorrow. Thank you for telling me all this." Buck said, "I'm really sorry, but I think you must understand my last resort." Roger smiled and said, "See you tomorrow." Buck said, "It's been 15 years, Amberton." Roger said, "See you tomorrow." After Buck left, Roger stood blankly, facing the window, still putting his two thumbs in his trouser pockets, and patting his thighs gently with the other fingers. Following the rhythm of his hands, his heels also tapped on the ground. He used the sound to cover up his own intermittent sobs. He couldn't let himself hear himself cry. Actually, it wasn't that I was crying. It was just that I couldn't hold a breath for a while. He was in this state for only a minute or two, and then recovered. He is leaving Hong Kong. Yesterday he called it a dank, hot, foreign town. Today he knows that it is his only hometown. He still has his mother in England, but when he goes home every 4 or 5 years, he always feels uncomfortable. However, what is there in the East that is worthy of nostalgia? Not his job. When he first came to teach at South China University 15 years ago, he was a young man who loved his work passionately. While working, he sometimes used his brain to think, but the atmosphere at South China University is not conducive to thinking. In spring, the azaleas all over the mountain turn red in the lingering rain, falling endlessly and reddeningly in summer. When you climb over the lowest ridges to go to class, there are red and hot hibiscus flowers blooming along the road, like many burnt-out little suns. In autumn and winter, the air is crisp and sweet, like sandwich cookies. The mountain breeze and the sea breeze blow the brown, green, and pale silver trees. You just want to take a few dogs, howl and climb mountains, and do some mindless, strenuous exercise. Time passed like this. In the past 15 years, he has not changed his lecture notes. The research on physical chemistry is progressing with each passing day. But he never reads the new scientific books and magazines. He has even forgotten most of what he has read before. He still uses the textbook he used 15 years ago. When he was studying in the UK 20 years ago, he still used the notes he took from lectures as supplementary materials. He occasionally told a few jokes in class, which he had been telling for 15 years. The lesson on nitrogen has nitrogen jokes, hydrogen has hydrogen jokes, and oxygen has oxygen jokes. Such a person, as long as he knows a little bit of humor, he can't think too highly of himself, right? He didn't think highly of himself, and he didn't have much confidence in the university education he had devoted half his life to. However, in any case, it is not a bad thing to gather 1,000 leisurely young people in a beautiful environment. Even if you ignore troublesome things, such as their intelligence and spirituality, good or bad, he has lived that way for 15 years. He has not bothered anyone. He is just a law-abiding person. Why is the girl with yellow hair not letting him live like this? Thinking of sushi, he went to the room to look for sushi. She squatted on the ground and sorted the box, with a small flowered saucer attached to her knees. Round her were piles of Chinese azure satin patchwork and bright red and gold skirts for costume dancing. Hearing his footsteps, she raised her head, but her eyes were dazzled by the low-hanging lamp and she couldn't see him. She smiled and said, "It's been so long." He didn't speak, just stood at the door, his huge shadow covering the entire roof. Suxi thought he was staring at her with the same longing as before, so she decided to be more generous. She tilted her head slightly and yawned. Her blue double eyelids were about to close in a daze, and she said with a smile, "I'm going to sleep. Now you can kiss me, just once." Roger heard this as he spoke. He suddenly felt that his two arms were extremely heavy, filled with energy, and felt sore from the fall. He might actually hit her. He didn't, of course he didn't. He just tilted his head back and laughed. His laughter was like a string of firecrackers with small red cloth strips blown to pieces, jumping in the air and jumping back to his face. Slap him on the cheek. Suxi was startled, unable to squat properly, and sat on the ground, looking at him in astonishment. He finally stopped laughing, as if he had something to say to her, looked at her, and started laughing again, laughing all the way out. That night, he stayed in the hotel. The next day, he went to the principal's office to submit a formal letter of resignation. Buck played with the piece of paper and asked slowly, "Of course, you are going to continue to help us for 1 month after submitting your resignation according to our original contract?" Roger said, "Well, if you think that is absolutely necessary. I know that this school is very busy this month, but Mr. McPherson can mark the exam papers for me. And Lambert, you also expressed that you think he is quite reliable," Buck said. "No matter how reliable he is, this is the time for the big test. You know you are indispensable here." Roger remained silent. After all this trouble, how could he continue to work with the professors, teaching assistants, and secretaries here? How could he control the students in the dormitory? He knew exactly what a filthy piece of shit they made of him. Buck added, "I fully understand that there are special reasons for your resignation this time. Under such circumstances, I cannot insist that you fulfill your original conditions. But I still hope that you will stay here for 3 more weeks, for our many years of friendship. I already said it yesterday, and I am willing to say it again today. I am extremely sorry for what happened this time. I have wronged you in various ways, and I am truly sorry beyond words. Maybe you think I am not a friend enough. If I lose a friend like you because of this, then I will feel even more sorry for myself. But Emberton, I think you know that if I feel sorry for myself for the sake of my position, I will feel sorry for myself. This is not the first time." Roger was moved by these words. He was a man Buck particularly admired. In the past 15 years, he has always done things according to the rules and without any chaos. Now he should start and finish. He thought for a while and decided, "Okay, I'll wait until the exam is over and the staff meeting is over before I leave." Buck stood up, shook hands with him and said, "Thank you." Roger also stood up, said goodbye to him, and left the principal's office. He had long expected that the task he would take on would not be an easy task, but the reality was more complicated than he thought. He is the head of science and housemaster. During the college entrance examination period, he had many personal contacts with students. There were oral exams and experiments in the exams in the dormitory. He could not allow them to stay up all night, and other deviant behaviors. Students who were overly nervous often quarreled over trivial matters and went to the dormitory. Some students finished the exam early. Once the mood relaxes, there must be a violent reaction. Roger cannot let them hold a carnival party in the dormitory and disturb other people. Roger was extremely afraid of this kind of negotiation, because the students were young and energetic and not good at hiding their inner feelings. He had been managing the dormitory for many years, and he had offended them a lot. They had never had a good impression of him, but they did not dare to express anything because of their prestige. Now that he himself had misbehaved and lost his dignity, they ignored their dignity and spoke rudely in front of him. When he turned around, they openly laughed at him. Roger always felt that his back was wet with sweat when he walked among the crowd. There was a big piece, and the white coat clung to his body in rumples. As for the faculty, they were certainly more nurturing than the students. Not only were they nonchalant on the surface, but they were also particularly considerate of him. They never mentioned the move of his apartment, as if he had been living in a hotel all these years. They also didn't talk about things at school, because he was not included in their future plans, and maybe he was a little confused. They avoid all moral issues. Leisure products such as novels and movies have too many relationships with men and women, and they cannot criticize or introduce them in front of him. They do not alternately talk about the richness of the East and the shortcomings of the West as usual, because recently the only topic of conversation within faculty circles was his marriage. Even politics and the overall situation of the world they did not dare to mention easily, because there were often one or two grumpy old men who would exhort everyone not to forget to maintain the prestige that the white race deserved in the colonies. So everyone immediately fell silent and thought about Roger, the scandalous history of Amberton. They were afraid that he would find it taboo on many topics, so they had almost nothing to say to him and were pitifully embarrassed. He avoided them partly out of pity, but at the same time, his too obvious tact also made him very embarrassed. However, what he couldn't bear the most was the attitude of ordinary women towards him. Female secretaries, female typists, female students, and teachers' wives all looked at him with big, stupid and gentle eyes like cows. Their faces turned red and white with fear, fearing that his unhealthy subconscious would suddenly attack, make him do something he shouldn't do. They despise him and hate him, but at the same time they cringe like all criminals, brutal, savage, primitive men. If he stays here too long, one day they will force him into this kind of person. Because of this, he was even more eager to leave Hong Kong. He took 2 days' work and did it in 1 day. He knew that Sexy and his matter were very difficult to resolve. The divorce laws in the UK are particularly strict. Divorce agreed by both parties is not legally valid, unless one party commits adultery, is crazy, or goes to jail for a crime. There is no hope of rescinding the contract. If they had merely separated by covenant, he would have had to support her. He couldn't gain a foothold in Hong Kong and wanted to make a living elsewhere. Of course, she was reluctant to take her with him. And even he was reluctant to take her with him. How could he be able to maintain 2 families if he didn't take her with him? In the current hostile situation, will Sexy and her mother understand the difficulty of his situation? But it did them no good to drive him crazy. He believed that Mrs. Mikir always had a way. She was an experienced mother-in-law. Didn't Mi Li Sheng and her husband divorce smoothly? Sexy had already gone home, and Mrs. Michelle called and asked people to look for Roger several times. Roger always tried to convey to people that he was busy and that no matter what happened, he would have to talk about it after a few days. In the past few days, it was simply impossible for him to calmly handle the disputes in his marriage. On this Saturday afternoon, the exam finally came to an end. The McPhersons and Buck's eldest son invited him to play tennis. The 4 of them had been playing tennis together for many years. They had to invite him now because they didn't want him to feel any different from the past. Something was different about the past. However, There is always something strange about the strangeness. Mrs. McPherson was absent-minded as soon as she came on the court. After playing a few games, she couldn't stand it anymore and stopped. Buckson sat with her on the bench beside the lawn, watching Roger and McPherson singles. Roger was running back and forth when he suddenly felt that there was an extra woman next to Mrs. McPherson outside the stadium. She put her hand on her eyebrows and looked at him intently. While looking at him, he said something to Mrs. McPherson, laughing so hard that she couldn't stand it. "Come on." Mrs. McPherson looked a little embarrassed. He felt that he was an animal in the zoo and he could no longer fight. He threw away the racket and said to McPherson, "I'm tired. Let Buck play a few games with you." McPherson smiled. "You gave up?" Mrs. McPherson said, "People are willing to give up. Unlike you, I think you should have rested long ago." Buck called his father to ask for something. "It's getting late. Let's go back." Roger and McPherson walked out of the stadium together. Roger recognized the woman as Dorinda, Professor Morrissey's house-filling wife. Dorinda is an Englishman with Jewish blood. She has curly beige hair that is uncontrollably thick and piled high on her head. She has a thick nose and a small fat chin that shrinks back. The slightly protruding light blue eyes are only narrowed when smiling, making them a bit enchanting. It was said that she had performed on stage in Tianjin before and had a flexible body, but now she was wearing a large green-white coat, with her hands in her pockets, stretching the coat so straight that her figure could not be seen. Mao Lishi's attempt to marry Dorinda had aroused the dissatisfaction of the general public of South China University. Before Roger made this incident, Mao Lishi's marriage was one of the most sensational moves. Roger himself had severely criticized Mao Lishi. As a result, the rift between the two of them deepened. Now Mao Lishi's revenge is even sweeter. Dorinda has known Roger for 2 or 3 years since she moved into the campus of South China University, but she has never paid so much attention to him. After she greeted Roger and McPherson with a smile, she said, I invite the 3 of you over for a casual dinner tonight. My husband is bringing many friends back later, so we can all join in the fun." Mrs. McPherson said calmly, "I'm sorry, I have something to do, so I'm afraid I won't be able to come." "Got it." Dorinda said to McPherson, "What about you? Let me tell you, my husband recently got a bottle of brandy from 1830. I'm a little suspicious that he was deceived. Come and try it and see. Is it true or not?" Then he smiled at Mrs. McPherson and said, "He is the only one who knows these things, don't you think?" Mrs. McPherson didn't answer, and McPherson smiled and said, "Thank you, I'll be there on time." "What time is it?" Dorinda said. "Exactly 8 o'clock." McPherson said, "Do you want to wear an evening dress?" Dorinda said, "No need." "Professor Amberden, you have to come today. You haven't been here for a long time." "We've been there before," Roger said. "I'm really sorry. I found out a little late. I had an appointment first." They talked all the way to the stone steps in the mountains. Dorinda said, "No, if I had known it earlier, I would have come. And if I had known it later, I would have come." She walked behind Roger. Roger suddenly felt a hand patting him twice on the shoulder. He was filled with disgust. There was a slight tremor in the muscles all over his body. When he looked back, he saw that it was not her hand, but the moss-green silk scarf wrapped around her neck. It was picked up by the evening wind and turned over to him with licks. He couldn't help but think of the delicate white silk yukata on the balcony of Mediocre's house. The sea at dusk. The long string of green gasoline lamps on the other side of Kowloon, blinking his eyes. Now, again it was dusk, and it was time to rest, think, and remember her. He was afraid. No matter what, he couldn't stay alone in the hotel. He smiled at Dorinda and said, "I can't talk to Professor Mao Lishi's friends. They are all literati." McPherson interjected, "By the way, it's their turn to hold their literary symposium today. Everyone must be drunk again. Why did you choose today to treat us?" Duolinda chuckled and said, "They either come drunk or leave drunk. What's the difference?" "Professor and Baden, you have to come and see Mao Lishi's drunken look. It's so ridiculous." Roger thought for a moment. "It's okay if we all get drunk together." Then she said, "Okay, thank you. I'll come." Dorinda walked up the gravel stairs in high heels, swaying, and couldn't help feeling frightened, so she put her hand on Roger's shoulder. Roger thought it was her scarf at first, but later found out it was her hand. He quickly used his hand to support Mrs. McPherson and said to McPherson, "Help Mrs. Morris. It's dark. I'm afraid of falling." Dorinda had no choice but to retract her hand and hold McPherson's arm. The four of them walked to the three-way intersection together. Dorinda and the McPhersons went home separately. Roger went down the mountain alone and drove back to the hotel. After changing his clothes, it was almost 8 o'clock and went to Malishi's house for a banquet. As expected, Malishi and the members of his literary symposium were all drunk and drank a lot during the dinner. After the meal, everyone sat around the electric fan, with their tongues hanging out and their faces red, as they debated the issue of Indian independence. The section about the prestige that white people should have in the colonies is about to come up. Roger quietly walked away and turned on the radio. Unexpectedly, the radio needed to be repaired, and a strange sound of pop, 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 boo, 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 boo. Boo 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 boo. Roger quickly closed it with a slap and walked to the window with his hands behind his back. There was a green satin sofa facing out by the window covered with an emerald green woven Malay mat. There was an open magazine on the mat. On that page, there happened to be a crossword puzzle chart. Roger sat down and took out a fountain pen from his inner pocket, then filled in the words one by one. While he was filling it in, Dorinda came over and said with a smile, "What are you doing hiding here alone?" Roger suddenly felt that his behavior was self-rewarding, a bit like a demure and quiet old maid, and he couldn't help but feel ashamed and busy. He pushed the magazine under the sofa cushion on the right side, but half of it was still exposed. Dorinda had already seen it clearly. She sat down on his left side and said with a smile, "I like this thing very much. Come, 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 let me see. You should have almost filled it in, right?" He turned over to pick up the magazine, sitting on Roger's left side, with his palm resting on Roger's right side. Unable to withstand a slight slip, he fell on top of Roger. She was wearing a tight-fitting robe of light black and silver leather crepe, and the clothes on her chest seemed to have two little squirrels, rubbing heavily on Roger's knees. Roger stood up suddenly, and she rolled down to the ground with a thud. Roger's first priority was to turn around and observe whether the people in the room had noticed them. Fortunately, Malishi and others were engaged in a debate. The electric fan whirred and turned on, and someone turned on the radio again. The jazz music from Hong Kong Hotel and the cheers like spring thunder could be heard faintly. Roger was sweating. If he hooked up with his wife in front of Malishi, wouldn't that prove that he was a nymphomaniac, and he got worse without asking for it? He lowered his head to look at Dorinda and saw that she was lying on the ground, motionless, but he knew that she had not fallen or fainted. She was thinking, "What are you thinking about? What is this greedy and vulgar woman thinking?" In these few seconds, he was extremely afraid of her. He was afraid that she would turn around. He was so afraid that he stood there without daring to move. She finally turned over with support, sat on the ground, rested her head on the edge of the sofa, raised her face and stared at him. In this dark corner, her moist face, the outline of her eyebrows, eyes, mouth and nose, were all gleaming with light, like a luminous watch at night. She whispered in her slightly hoarse voice, "Don't suppress yourself too much, I advise you." But when had he ever suppressed himself? Not only did he not love Dorinda, she didn't even have any simple sexual attraction for him. He didn't like her kind of beauty. But how does he know that he has not suppressed himself? Everyone seems to know more about his subconscious activities than he does. After these experiences of fear and shame, can he still have a normal sex life? Dorinda said again, "It is dangerous to suppress too much. Do you know how Frank Dingbai died? Roger lost his voice. Frank Dingbai. Mi Li Sheng's husband. Dead huh? Dorinda sneered and replied. He committed suicide. When I met him in Tianjin, he couldn't find anything. Roger said. He couldn't find anything. Duoling Da said. So what if he finds something? He still doesn't enjoy life. Poor man, he has stronger desires than others, but he suppresses himself. As a result, he goes a little crazy. You heard no, dear? She reached out and hugged his knees. My dear, don't hurt yourself. He didn't understand any of her words. There was only one sentence in his mind. Mi Li Sheng's husband was forced to death by them. Mi Li Sheng's husband was forced to death by them. For some reason, he suddenly felt an overflowing peace. At first, he seemed to be on fire. The lamp was in a hot little room. I was half asleep and had strange dreams. Mosquitoes and midges were swarming around the light bulb like golden and green clouds. Then he turned off the light. Darkness starts from the hut and goes all the way to the end of the universe, the ancient wilderness, a place where man's fantasy and the shadow of God have not left a trace, the vast peace and silence. The inside and outside of the house became one, and the darkness of the universe entered his house. He shivered and became half cold. Dorinda clung to his legs, but he did not feel it. As she staggered out, Dorinda was pulled by him unexpectedly, and her upper body fell to the ground again. Roger walked through the crowd and walked out the door without saying goodbye to his owner. Everyone stared at him, and Mao Lishi shook his head and said, I didn't drink much just now, so why did I get so drunk? Lan Bo said, it's okay to go. This man, maybe he drank too much. What would he do to scare the ladies? It would be bad. Dorinda had already gotten up and walked to the front of the room. She saw Roger's hat on a chair and bounced. She flicked her forehead and said with a smile, I forgot to take my hat. Well, I think this person's illness is getting worse. I'm afraid he won't recover. She grabbed the hat, ran out and chased her on the steps. He got on Roger and shouted, Professor Amberton, here's your hat. He threw a hat over and happened to land on Roger's head. Roger didn't seem to quite understand what was going on. Without turning around, he stood still, slowly stretched out his hand to pinch the brim of his hat. Then held the hat with both hands and turned it. Turn, turn, after walking round into complete circles and groping for a long time. I felt that it fit me properly, so I turned around, took off my hat, and bowed stiffly to Dorinda. Dorinda folded her strong arms in front of her chest, hunched her shoulders and smiled at him, then went in. Roger did not go down the mountain to find his car and go back to the hotel, but walked along the mountain road towards the boys' dormitory. This road was the road where his wife ran out on the wedding night, and he chased and shouted after her. That seemed to have happened hundreds of years ago. It's another moonlit night, and there are black islands floating in the sea outside the mountains. There are mountains on the islands, there is the sea beyond the mountains, and there are mountains overseas. On the sea, on the rocks, and on the leaves of the trees, there was a whimpering, flute-like clear light everywhere. But Roger only felt that wherever he went, it was getting darker. Encountering several groups of students on the road, he touched the brim of his hat and nodded to them. Whether they greeted him or not, he couldn't tell clearly. Maybe they couldn't see him at all. Like a ghost returning home to dream, he walked unsteadily to the door of his house and looked at the darkness inside. There was no light even in the servants' room, presumably because he had not been home for many days. And the servants took the time to go to the countryside to visit their relatives. He took out his key, opened the door, went in, and turned on the light. The hall was full of dusty hangings. He took off his hat and hung it on the hook. The mirror on the coat rack was also dim. He stretched out an index finger and wiped it on the mirror, then walked towards the kitchen. The light bulb in the kitchen was taken off by a servant for some unknown reason, so he had to open the door, fill a pot of water with the help of a little light in the hall, and heat it on the gas stove. During the time it took to boil a kettle of water, he stood aside, minding his own business. The water was about to boil. He pressed his hand on the handle of the pot and could feel the warm pot shaking and making a whining sound, as if a person was crying there. He stood beside the pot in a daze, and a puff of hot air rushed to his face, making his face completely wet. The water boiled and he moved the kettle aside. The light of the gas fire was like a huge blue chrysanthemum with a black heart, its slender petals curling inwards. He gradually turned down the fire, and the petals gradually became shorter, and almost gone. Only a neat circle of small blue teeth remained. The teeth gradually disappeared, but before they were completely eliminated, they suddenly appeared outwards. With a pounce, it stretched out into sharp fangs 1 or 2 inches long. In just a moment, it exploded and turned into nothing. He turned off the gas, closed and bolted the door, then turned the gas back on, but this time he did not strike a match to light the fire. The faint sweetness unique to gas gradually became stronger. At the same time, the incense of Roger Amberton gradually faded away. The Agarwood shavings were burned out, the fire went out, and the ashes became cold. May 1943.
Alright, this story has come to an end. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you.